morning, good morning. All right, thank you all for joining us. I know you're standing there. You can headlock them, get them down in the seats. Okay, good morning, y'all. I'm Mandy Drogan. I'm a senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am so grateful that y'all have joined us today to talk about the very clear and growing threat of the evil totalitarian political ideology of Islamism and Islamist supremacists that seek to implement that political ideology by installing a caliphate and Sharia law in Texas and across America. This is real, and I think that most of the people in this room, your eyes have been opened, but today I am thrilled to be joined by experts that are going to be leading the charge in the 90th legislative session to pass laws that are constitutional, that protect our constitutional republic, and not only the Texas or the nations, but I would say internationally, a leading expert that has been tracking these cells, these entities of Islamist supremacists that have infiltrated our state and our country. So I'm going to start by introducing Sam Westrop. Sam is this international expert. You will hear he has a lovely British accent that is wonderful, but he is a Texan, and he is committed to protecting the land of the free. And as we all know, as goes Texas, so will go America. Sam is an expert. He's at the Middle East Forum, the international leader of tracking what's going on with Islamist extremists and supremacists across the country, and he also is the director of Islamist Watch. So he's gonna fill y'all in on all the details of what's going on. Then next to Sam is Chairman Cole Hefner. He will be leading the charge on the House. He is the chairman of Homeland Security. There is nothing more important than protecting our lives and our land here in Texas. So he's going to dig into what he's hearing and how he is going to stop this growing threat. And then finally, Senator Hagenbu. He will also be leading this charge from the Senate. We have a unified effort. We hear your concerns. And so we are just going to dive right into what in the world is happening in Texas with these Islamist supremacists that have come into our state. Sam, what's going on?
Well, thank you so much. I track, with my Muslim colleagues and partners, 8,000 non-profit Islamic organizations in the United States. About 1/3 of those are under some degree of Islamist influence or control. 650 of them are based in Texas. And again, about 1/3 of those 650 are under Islamist influence or control. This is a pattern we see in states across the country. Islamist control, I think when most people think of Islamism, they tend to think of the Muslim Brotherhood or of Salafi jihadists such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The truth is that Islamism is a far broader subject. It is a far broader threat. Like Islam itself, Islamism is diverse. It features hundreds of competing sects and movements, vying with each other for power, for attention, for money, for political access and control. Now, we track about 7 major networks in the United States. These networks are all active in Texas. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, you've heard of. But its offshoots, Hamas, is still alive and well up in North Texas. The Holy Land Foundation, a name I imagine many of you will remember from the trial in the 2000s, a major Hamas charity up in Dallas, when they prosecuted that charity and imprisoned its leaders, it left behind an unprosecuted network, unindicted co-conspirators who continue to flourish, who continue to operate with impunity across North Texas. It includes groups like the Muslim American Society, perhaps the purest expression of Muslim Brotherhood ideology, but also charities in Irving, Texas, like Baitul Mal. Baitul Mal is a charity that openly works with Hamas proxies in Gaza, that openly employs wildly anti-Semitic and anti-American officials. But it extends beyond just Hamas and the Brotherhood. It goes to groups like Jamaat-e-Islami, the South Asian cousin of the Muslim Brotherhood, which down in Houston works hand in hand with not just the Pakistani consulate, but Kashmiri jihadist supporters as well. Jamaat-e-Islami not only incites hatred against Hindus, but openly advocates for Sharia here in Texas. They have partners, the Deobandis, another South Asian movement. The best expression of Deobandi Islamism you might have heard of is the Taliban. Indeed, we spent 20 years fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. I've never heard a policymaker even aware of the term Deobandiism, because we failed to understand these threats. We failed to recognize and learn these names. And once you define the threat, you can fight it. You can identify allies within American Islam, and you can identify the bad guys. But Deobandism is alive and well. In fact, Texas is the key center for Deobandi Islam in the United States. It has a missionary movement called Tablighi Jamaat, which European counterintelligence services regard as a key radicalizing force in hundreds of terror finance and homegrown radicalization cases. And yet Tablighi Jamaat's headquarters in the US is, guess where? Texas, in Garland, a mosque called Masjid Yassin. Or take the Barelwis, another South Asian Islamist movement, a rival to the Deobandis. The Barelwis have a whole number of subsects. One is called the Dawat-e-Islami. The Dawat-e-Islami is recognized by the British government as a dangerous force because of its promotion of what they call anti-blasphemy extremism, their efforts to kill and incite violence against Muslims who aren't Muslim enough or non-Muslims as well. Dawat-e-Islami's headquarters in the US is, guess where? Texas, Houston. In fact, their first mosque was down in Houston. And they raise a significant amount of money. They should be designated, as should Tablighi Jamaat, as should a whole host of other groups. In fact, we have a list of all these networks and their sub-networks and their sub-movements who should be on state designation lists. The Muslim Brotherhood designation was a great start, but we need to understand that Islamism goes beyond the Brotherhood, it goes beyond Hamas. It is a whole host of different networks and operations. We haven't even discussed the Shias, the Khomeinist mosques aligned with the Iranian regime, with the Houthis, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, operating across the state. Down in Houston, the Islamic Education Center of Houston, the imam there is directly appointed by the Supreme Leader's Office of Iran. That the federal government hasn't investigated and shut this group down as an unlicensed foreign agent is an injustice. Now maybe the state can step in. Maybe the state can act where the federal government is failing to. Then finally, of course, you have the Salafis. And Salafism is a broad term. It can be jihadists, yes, but it can also be those who work within the political system, like the Brotherhood. And Texas is the center for Salafism in the world. Two imams in particular have tens of millions of followers around the world. Omar Suleiman, who runs the Valley Ranch Islamic Center up in Irving, but also Yasir Qadhi, who runs the East Plano Islamic Center, or EPIC. You might have heard of EPIC because of the EPIC community center that's been in the news so much over the past year. These two imams are not just inspiring Muslims around the world, they're exporting Islamism around the world. And this is perhaps the key message I want everyone to take away today. American Islamism, and particularly Texas Islamism, is no longer dependent on patronage and support from the East. No, we are a net exporter. Muslims in the East look to the ideas conceived here in Texas by Islamist groups to guide their ideology, to shape their ideology. America, and particularly Texas, are shaping the development and the threat of Islamism worldwide. This is a much more serious problem than I think anyone quite realizes. So on the one hand, yes, you need to understand the diversity, the breadth of American Islamism and Texas Islamism. But two, you need to understand that we are not a casualty of a foreign threat. We have the threat right here. It is emanating from our very backyard. And finally, there is a way to stop this. Defund these groups. Make sure they have no access to public money. Make sure they are not misusing the non-profit system, which they sure as hell are. Two, designate them. The Brotherhood designation, as I mentioned, a great start, but there are a host of other groups that need to be designated. All the networks I've mentioned tonight, as well as their sub-networks tonight. I'm sorry, I've spoken too many evening events over the last few weeks. Today, the groups I've mentioned deserve to be designated. And finally, debilitate these networks. Make sure these groups are exposed in the state legislature, in the media. Make sure you're speaking with your representatives, with your federal representatives as well. Make sure these groups, extremism and commitment to terror and radicalization is common knowledge, is public knowledge, is understood by every Texan, every American. These 3 Ds, designate, defund, and debilitate, should form the cornerstone of an effective counter-Islamist policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. It's a big threat, y'all, and we're watching it. But it's not new, right, Sam? This is not something that just happened in the past 12 or 18 months. They have taken a playbook out of the Chinese Communist Party. You know, we all watched a decade plus ago when Confucius Institutes had infiltrated our public school systems across America. And the same thing is occurring in our public school systems across Texas. So I'm going to turn this over to Senator Hagenbu, who can talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the public schools with the Arabic programs, world culture programs, teacher training, summer camps, all created and run by Islamists from the Middle East. I'm talking about the Qatari International Foundation. I'm talking about these groups that want to use soft power, and they have been using soft power. They've hired lobbyists here. They are pushing the curriculum, and this is all across our state. It seems like it's just popped up at a few districts celebrating Ramadan or hosting games or whatever. This is everywhere. Senator, talk to us a little bit about what we know is happening in K through 12, but also really K through 16, and how we can address this major crisis and identify the evil political ideology of Islamism that is being promoted in our schools.
Yep. Thank you. Room Safe First Mandy, thank you for having me in TPPF. You said we're experts up here. Sam's the expert, but you couldn't find anybody who's more concerned about this. I got involved in politics just briefly because I felt like there were forces trying to tear down what our country is built on, and this is absolutely one of them. And Scott Jennings just said that we're in a battle for the soul of our country, and I think we are, and this is part of it. In terms of, we got to look at across all of our society here, but I'm on the education committee, and I'm the vice chair of the higher education committee, so this is an area that I'm very concerned about. I'll tell you some things that are going on in K through 12 and in higher education. K through 12, we see things like Islamic games. We see hijab day where they're putting hijabs on girls' heads. We see them passing out their Quran pamphlets that have a lot of anti-Semitic things in them. We see people who we think are associated with CARE are trying to influence the state school board to include, sort of go easier on Islam and promote it to some degree. We need to do the opposite. We had SB 24 that Senator Campbell put in place for teaching the perils of communism. We need a bill just like that, the perils of Islamic supremacy. And I'm happy to introduce that. Whoever we got to get, I think we have to get that done. It's critically important. In higher education, well, we know October 11th, when you would have thought there'd been an uprising or mass group of people concerned about the atrocities that happened in Israel, instead there was encampments, protests, violence, anti-Semitism going on, all trying to support the Palestinians, what happened there. Terrible. And we know all those groups you talked about and Sam talked about are behind those things. I'm working with a group called Mothers Against Anti-Semitism in Colleges at UNT, which is in my district. We see groups operating there like SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. And through Sam's help, it looks like we can trace that they are associated with some of these networks. Clearly with the Iranian regime, and they've had influence, they've financed this, and you see them on campuses. There was I think the Texas Coast Guard had an example of a video at A&M where one of these students was just chastising and saying all kinds of anti-Semitic things to a group of Jewish students. The group Mothers Against Anti-Semitism say that there's like 500 Jewish students at UNT who are just kind of scared to profess they're Jewish. So we have to change those things on campuses. And I believe that, it's critical there. There's a number of things we can do, but we have SB 37, which I believe we need to implement because it gets rid of a lot of these kinds of things out of higher education, and I think that will help with that. But there's a number of things we need to do in higher education, and we can go into more detail about that. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for laying out. And this is really just a small portion of what they're doing in our schools, right? They are organized and they are coming and affecting the curriculum. We have a lot of leaders in here that showed up this week. In fact, they're going to do the first vote today at the State Board of Education. And if you're not aware, CARE, and they've created some other phony group because CARE is a designated terrorist organization, but they have bussed in people from across our state to stand up in front of the SBOE and claim that we just want to be included and we shouldn't be talking about Christianity, but we need to talk about the contribution of Islamists. But they also don't want us to talk about the fact that they conquered 3/4 of Christendom. They don't want us to talk about what is promoted. They don't want us to talk about this evil political ideology. It's all about inclusivity. And it's all about being nice. And this is what they do, and we have to say no. And these gentlemen are armed with the facts, but they also need your support at the legislative level to make sure that we are standing firm and we are not capitulating to the literally purple-haired people that show up and say, America welcomes everybody. No, we do not. We do not welcome anybody that seeks to subvert our constitutional republic and overthrow our government. And that is okay to say that, and everybody should. So, thank you. Chairman Hefner, you have done an amazing job as the chairman of Homeland Security of clamping down on these foreign hostile nations purchasing our farmland, investing in our infrastructure and whatnot. Talk to us a little bit about what you've done and what we need to do. We've historically paid a lot of attention to the CCP and their evil divisive tactics of trying to take over all of what's going on in Texas, our growth, and as well as in our school system with those soft power plays. So what have you done, and how can we translate this to this growing threat of Islamism and those Islamist supremacists that want to implement their evil ideology in Texas and really across America?
Yeah, so thank you, Mandy, and TPPF for having us. Thank you all for being here. This is a big, nice crowd this morning. Yeah, so the Homeland Security Committee, historically kind of focused on border issues, police, law enforcement issues, and Second Amendment issues. That was kind of the three big things. There was a lot of other things come through there, but that was kind of the focus of the committee for so many years. But it is rapidly evolving into a true Homeland Security mission, and so we're learning about new threats are coming on, and we're learning about them and how we as a state can identify those threats, figure out what our authorities are and powers are as a state to address them, and then what we have the resources and manpower and things to do, and how we prioritize those needs. And so last session we started in the interim hearings with, we can back up even further than that. When we first started talking about foreign adversaries owning land in Texas, it was the farmland is what we were focused on, because that makes sense, right? It's easy. It's like if they control our food supply, that's a real problem. I mean, that's an immediate problem. But once you dig into that, it's so much broader than that. The unrestricted warfare doctrine that the CCP uses, where they infiltrate education and research and property and everywhere they can get their tentacles in, I think we're seeing that happen with the Islamists as well. They've learned to kind of infiltrate our businesses, our education systems, higher education, and so it's a complicated web to try to unwind. And so I think it's important that we take a strong stand against the Islamist supremacy that they're trying to force on us. It's anti-American, it's anti-Texan, it's anti-Christian, it's anti-free market, anti-capitalism, and the inalienable rights that we believe come from God, from our Creator, and that government is there to protect those rights. The government is not here to tell us what our rights are. It's here to protect those rights that are given to us by God. And under the Islamic supremacist, you don't have those rights. And so I think there's a lot of things that we need to be looking at doing. Texas needs to step up and do everything we can aggressively as a state where we can fit in. Another thing we need to do is Congress needs to do their job. I'll give y'all, I get a little frustrated with Congress. They do a lot of press conferences and a lot of tweeting and not a lot of doing. And I'll give you an example of that. Last year, in the calendar year, Congress sent less than 75 bills to the president's desk. I think it was 40 or 50, so I'm giving them some. We sent 1,300 to the governor, and a dozen of those, and that's a lot of bills, right? So not all bills we pass are always good. I vote no a lot. But Around a dozen of those were specifically targeted to foreign adversaries. We had about a dozen Second Amendment bills to help ensure our Second Amendment freedoms. And so there's a lot of talk happens in Congress and not a lot of action. So they need to be taken care of. The asylum laws, immigration laws, all the H-1B visas, R-1 visas, all those programs are federal. And so, and then here we are as a state going, how do we fix the problems that Washington created? And I'm not talking about the Trump administration. I'm talking about decades that have led us to where we are. Our dependency on foreign adversaries for so much of our manufacturing and rare earth materials and antibiotics and computer chips and all kinds of things. And so we're going to be taking an aggressive look. I think there may be some other committees that work on this issue as well. In 2017, I did vote for the American Law for American Courts bill. Representative Flynn passed that in my first session, to where it just stipulates that no other law can come in and supersede the Constitution of the United States and Texas. But we also have to make sure that we're cultivating that culture, that Republican form of government, Republican representative form of government that we enjoy in this country, and it's not automatic. So we need to make sure that we're telegraphing that and communicating that to our people, as well as looking for legislative action.
Thank you. Thank you for leading this in the Homeland Security, and I do think there will be significantly more bills that will be put forth, including in education and other spaces, because that soft power play that you're talking about, where really from the time we're in kinder or before, we're trying to teach children that this is an okay ideology, and that's part of the play. And Sam, I'm going to turn to you because my team, Kate Beerley, Cameron Abrams, we have a Texas graduate in here, Jordan Cope, who actually works with you at Middle East Forum, and they've been writing nonstop about how this soft power is used. But it's not just soft power. They really do try and use women, children, humanitarian aid under the guise. They cloak themselves under the guise of a religion and or under humanitarian efforts. And it's the Islamist supremacists that are behind all of that. Can you explain that a little bit more of why we see it's just women and children show up at the SBOE or show up at Austin City Council to get them to recognize Ramadan? If you're not familiar, in Austin ISD, we have no more Good Friday. Good Friday is not a day off, but Eid el-Fitr, one of the holiest Muslim holidays, is off. It is a desensitization now starting in our entities, and they do it under the guise of kindness, humanitarian efforts, religion. Talk to us about the harbinger that is the UK and why we need to put an end and stop essentially giving up our country under the guise of being welcoming and kind.
I think you're absolutely right to mention youth and children. Islamist schools and Islamist efforts to build a functioning and prosperous Islamist schools industry in Texas especially has been very noticeable over the past 10, 20 years. I mentioned earlier the Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood networks up in North Texas. Well, one of the schools in North Texas, the Brighter Horizons Academy, it was set up by officials of the Holy Land Foundation, that same charity that was designated and shut down by the federal government for funding terror. That school today employs a teacher who is the niece of Khalid Mishal, the head of Hamas. A very close family member, educating North Texas Muslim children. And these schools up in North Texas, or the Jamati Islami schools down in Houston, or indeed Deobandi and Salafi schools here in Austin, are frequently used by groups such as CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, as part of their outreach efforts, their lobbying efforts. Indeed, CARE runs an annual lobby day at the Capitol. I'm sure you may have come across their representatives from time to time. And they advertise for this lobbying day, through these schools. These schools are not just present at this annual event, however, they're involved every week, every month, in legislative campaigns, in grassroots activism, in protests against both local government in Collin County, but also on international issues such as Gaza and Iran. Islamists are incredibly good at setting up a variety of institutions catering to every facet of society. And this is the entire point about Islamism. They create within, especially within these smaller networks, these micro-societies that seek to cater to a Muslim resident's every need, and thus forces American Muslims to become dependent on Islamist leadership. And that dependency includes access to politics, to political representatives, to political power. So this is exactly what we saw in the UK 20, 30 years ago. One would have hoped that the US government, and indeed state governments, would have looked to Europe to see what happens when you mess up this badly, when you pursue these terrible policies. And the thing that really drove Europe to ruin was multiculturalism policy. And when I say multiculturalism, I'm not using that as a synonym for diversity, as it's often wrongly used. But multiculturalism policy was a very specific idea dreamt up by European Union bureaucrats and academics in the 80s that sought to regard citizens no longer as individuals, but as members of communities. In other words, governments should start dividing society into collections of racial and religious communities. Now, I'm sure this sounds familiar, because this is a conversation in America that has been happening, even if you haven't assigned it the word multiculturalism policy. But in Europe, this was absolutely the intention. So when it came to Muslims, what did the British government do? Well, it looked to Muslim communities and said, who are your leaders? And who do you think steps forward when you say to Muslim communities under the threat of Islamism, who are your leaders? Well, it's the Islamists who step forward, because they're the ones with the political wherewithal and the media know-how to present themselves as these leaders. So Europe appointed Islamists as leaders of European Muslims. They gave them money. They deputized certain services from health to community to education as well. The great fear in the US is that this is now happening too, and indeed it is happening to some extent. The huge risk of things like private school subsidies in this country, whether voucher programs just set up here in Texas or other forms of subsidies at the federal level as well, is that you end up helping these Islamists take control of Muslim communities. Now, I'm not arguing against private school subsidies. That's a separate conversation, and there's some very good arguments for it. I am saying, however, that unless you proactively stop groups like, networks like the Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, the Deobandis, the Salafis, all these networks I've mentioned, unless you proactively work to counteract them, they will take advantage of these public funds. They have taken advantage of these public funds. And just as a final note, I track tax returns. I scrape huge amounts of data from Islamist tax returns. And of the 8,000 organizations I track, about 4,000 of those file a return. There is a field in a 990 nonprofit tax return called government grants. You're supposed to disclose there how much you've received from local, city, county, federal government. Now, the IRS does not police this form, so this number is a wild undercount, especially as most organizations don't file a return because they claim a church exemption. But of the organizations that do, from within American Islam, they claim over the past 10 years over $1 billion of government funding. I imagine the true figure to be a lot more. So, what happens here in Texas? You have state and federal money creating schools and funding charities and financing political outreach campaigns that in turn seek to undermine Texas laws, undermine Texas rules, undermine the American Constitution, and advance Islamism over Muslim communities. This is what Europe did, and it now regrets this bitterly. Texas can act now and stop this, but it must become aware of these networks and their operations and take action today.
Senator?
Quick word on this. You started out talking about influence on children. The Lieutenant Governor put out his first 5 interim charges. The 5th one, so it's very important to him, is looking into these kind of influences on our children, and trying to go back to making sure we don't have those impacting our children, and then we go back to teaching American exceptionalism, Texas exceptionalism. It's really important. I believe that you totally agree with you. We need to look into these groups, designate them, ban them. The ones like SJP that have arms that are working in our K through 12 and higher education, we need to ban them. Another thing is the funding. We need to stop any funding from countries like Qatar. I went on an Israel trip with the Senate this fall and was in the kibbutz, and I was talking to a leader of that, and I asked him, after he'd driven around for a while up in the Golan Heights, I said, hey, this stuff's going on in the United States. What would you recommend? He could have said a lot of things. He said one thing: stop taking money from Qatar. So banning those organizations, get them off our campuses, out of our schools, stop taking money. And then the other thing that this interim charge talks about is is American exceptionalism, Texas exceptionalism. You know, there's a verse in the Proverbs that says, without a vision, the people go astray. We've been too deferential and not teaching our kids our basic American Texas values. And that's left a void in the liberals, communists, but also you can see these Islamist supremacists are filling that void. We need to go back and not have any compunction, not any concerns, but lean into teaching our kids what our country's about, what we're founded on, and the values that made us great.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And that's something I want to touch on. Two things that you just talked about. The Qatar Foundation, which is, again, has been putting Arabic and world culture programs influencing AP world history in our K through 12 system, doing the trainings for kids, doing the trainings for teachers, hosting summer camps, hosting sports events, all of this to try and desensitize this generation, desensitize less informed Texans. But also the Qatar Foundation, they are one of the largest, if not the largest, investors into our higher ed system. And I've heard a lot of pushback. Kate Beerley put out a great article recently talking about their influence in Texas A&M. So all our Aggies in here, I've got a lot of people that said, but we shut down the campus in Doha. What people don't realize is they enter into contracts specifically at our Texas A&M TEAS program. That's the Texas Experiment Station. Energy, environment. Kate, what is it? Engineering. And this is why it's really important. The Texas Engineering Experiment Station, the TEAS program at Texas A&M. Y'all, they've given almost $1 billion. No, let me rephrase that. They have paid almost $1 billion to have access, to own research of some of the brightest minds of Texans in nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, and national security issues. I asked Kate on a podcast, I said, what do they do with it? Don't they work with China? And she said, we don't know. We don't know what they're doing with it. So we are literally allowing our institutions to sell our national security issues for a paltry $1 billion. And so this is really, really important to all the Aggies. I didn't hear any whoops. Y'all always do it. Give me a whoop. Yes. This has to stop. They are not our friends. They also are called the main artery of funding for Hamas. You cannot sit on a fence. I once heard a story talking about, a young man was trying to make a decision. He was sitting on a fence. Is he a Christian? Is he not a Christian? Does he believe in God? Does he not believe in God? He was sitting on that fence, and then he died, and he was in hell. And the devil looked at him and said, welcome. He said, I didn't make a decision. He said, oh, I own that fence. They own that fence. If you are sitting on it, you are against American interests. You are against Western civilizations. You are against our constitutional republic. You may not sit on a fence, and you may not invest in our nuclear secrets, our AI intelligence, or any other aspect of our national security system. And that is so important for everyone to understand. So, I think we have QR codes up here. I'm getting questions, so I'm not being rude. I'm looking at my phone. I'm looking at y'all's questions. And one of the questions is a really good one. Hear this all the time because, again, Islamists, supremacists, evil human beings that believe that their job on earth is to take over America, they cloak themselves in a veil of religion, right? They say religious freedom. They are trying to weaponize our First Amendment rights. And so we get this all the time. When people, Sam, I'm going to turn to you, but Senator and Chairman, you guys can answer as well. When people argue that Muslims are peaceful people and it's just a few radicals that need to be stopped, what is a factual argument to push back on that, Sam?
Well, I mentioned the diversity of Islamism, but it's also very important to talk about the diversity of Islam as well. And Islam is a 1,400-year-old religion that has gone through extraordinary periods of tumult, of reform and radicalism. And as a result today, as a result of these splits and divisions and general factiousness, there are thousands of competing sects, delineated, divided by schools of theology, schools of philosophy, by certain adherents to cultural or other spiritual norms, there is no such thing as a normative, homogenous Islam, especially within the Sunni tradition. As a result, this is why my organization and indeed some of my colleagues in this field draw a very clear distinction between Islam and Islamism, not only because of the diversity of Islam, but because Islamism was a distinct development within the last 200 years that sought to merge certain aspects of Western collectivism from fascism and socialism and reconcile that with hardline religious ideas, but also because Islamism has introduced new ideas on top of Islam, especially around the subject of Sharia economics and Sharia law and so on. So when someone says, well, hang on, surely all Muslims are extreme or violent, I'll say, no, they're not. And we work with Muslims to fight Islamists. That has been the case for decades. I point to people like Azra Namani, the brilliant investigations editor at Fox News, who just did a fantastic report, by the way, on CCP, Chinese Communist Party networks in the US and their involvement with Islamist groups. Azra is an important American Muslim, part of something called the Clarity Coalition, a collection of American Muslims who fight Islamism, who warn about the Brotherhood, about Jamaat Islami, about all these networks I've mentioned. Now, it is another conversation for another day about whether Islam can go through a process of enlightenment or reformation. That is an interesting conversation, but a separate one. For the moment, I will just finish with this. We work with Muslims, we fund Muslims, we employ Muslims, and they are dedicated to a free America and to a pro-Israel cause and to a pro-democracy cause and in opposition to Islamism. No one is denying the huge number of Muslims under the Islamist spell, but as long as there are Muslims who support what we're saying here today, we should work with them and we should embrace them.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, Senator, I'm going to ask you this question. How do we explain the true intent of the First Amendment when discussing stopping the rise of the political ideology of Islamism?
Well, Muslimism is clearly a religion, right? It's a faith. But it's totally different when it starts to operate like a political organization group that's trying to basically overthrow our Constitution, change our laws, operate outside of what our government and our culture is, so to change our culture. So there's a big difference between them, right? One is absolutely religion, First Amendment applies. This is where we got to be able to distinguish and go, there's a difference between being a Muslim and being Islamist supremacist. Islamist supremacist isn't just practicing a religion. This is a political movement that is against, I think, everything our country and state stands for.
Thank you. I think that is really clear when we're talking about the Constitution. We want to protect freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That's one of the many things that makes America great. But when we're allowing people, the Islamist supremacists, because that's what they are aggressive, they are nasty, and they are here to take over, we have to call that out. And that is what it is, the political ideology that seeks to subvert our constitutional republic through seditious acts. Chairman.
Mandy, I would add, and you did great, Senator, but I would add that if a religion infringes on the inalienable rights of others, then that's where the line gets crossed. Yep. If your religion says you can, violate my inalienable rights, there's a clear distinction there.
And also, but if not just mine, but within an organization, in a religion or a faith, things like making women wear certain clothes, mutilating them, saying it's okay for husbands to beat their wives, those things are outside of our legal system, what we believe in. So I think even within some of those things that come out of that, we're not talking about the faith itself, we're talking about actions and ways they go about things that are contrary to our laws and our culture.
Absolutely. Okay, so this question I'm going to send over to Senator Hagenbu, who is the Vice Chair of Higher Ed, and this is really important because clearly someone is listening, I hope you Aggies are listening, about why there are no laws in place preventing universities from selling sensitive U.S. intellectual property. I have a feeling you're going to address this.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question, and as we've learned more about this, we've seen all the places they've infiltrated, and it's been going on longer than we thought. More deeply infiltrated, and it's definitely in our higher education, and we have to do a number of things to basically extract this infection out of our higher education. And one of them is absolutely, just like we shouldn't let the CCP, the Communist Party, have any of our technology, we should absolutely not let any of these organizations that Sam's talking about that are designated. They ought to be designated, and they ought to not be able to buy land, they ought to not get our technology. We have to really focus on this.
Absolutely. And I would also say, y'all heard the senator talk about a law similar to Senate Bill 24, which requires now that all Texas students starting in 4th grade, 4th through 12th, are going to learn the horrors, the 100+ million people killed because of communism. And that was a huge win that he helped pass last year, yes, and he's going back. That's right. He's going back and going to make sure that the political ideology of Islamism and the evil Islamist supremacists, that we also are teaching Texas kids about that. So we are going to need support, and he's going to need people to show up and testify to stand against their nefarious messaging tactics that they ultimately will use to try and say, you're being mean. We're not being mean. We're saving the republic, y'all. Okay, thank you. Next question is, what state laws currently exist to enable local communities to identify and stop the Islamification of our schools and city ordinances? Chairman?
What state laws currently exist? Well, I don't know about any specific, but I would say that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Texas Constitution falls under that. And I think things that would go contrary to those should have standing to be challenged in court, I would think. Anybody want to jump in there?
It's a slightly unrelated answer, but, well, related but unhelpful perhaps. The federal government, my biggest gripe with existing laws right now is not at the state level, but at the federal level. And the simple fact is, at the federal level, the laws are simply not being enforced when it comes to this issue. I mentioned this Hamas network up in North Texas. Well, these groups were unindicted co-conspirators in a major terror financing case. They have operated with impunity since then. We have Kashmiri jihadists down in Houston. A terrorist just convicted in India, a woman called Azriya Andrabi, known as the mother of jihad. Well, she operates an office down in Houston. I mentioned Dawati Islami and all these other groups tied to violence abroad, but Hizbul Mujahideen, designated terrorist organization, openly has charitable supporters based here in Texas. The federal government is very deliberately looking the other way, and they've done this since 2008 under the Obama administration, when there is an explicit decision to stop prosecuting certain Islamists from certain sects. ISIS and Al-Qaeda were still very much focused on, but the Brotherhood, Hamas, and some of these other networks I've mentioned, the decision was to look the other way. The thinking at the time was that these groups could become allies of the federal government against groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. If you think you can rely on Islamists to fight Islamism, you are insane. And yet that has been federal policy now for almost 20 years under both Democrat and Republican administrations. I'm hoping that will change. I'm certainly trying to make that change. But enforcing existing law is absolutely key. And once the federal government starts enforcing existing law, I think it will be a lot easier for the state to fill in the gaps.
Thank you.
In Texas, I think we're just trying to figure all this out. And I think we need to do something. I'm trying to come up with ideas, talk to a lot of legislators, some kind of commission that looks across all of our laws and sees what we have and what we need additionally. I think that the state and local governments need a way to stop these type enclaves until we can thoroughly invest in them, get them, look and see whether any of those networks are behind them, things like that. I think local government needs a way to say we can have ordinances that do zoning. You're not going to have certain things like maybe a mosque in a certain area or a call to prayer. So, but I think we need to have a commission or some concerted effort to look across the state at all the ways that they've infiltrated and look at the laws we do have, but what we need to implement to fight this whole thing. I think it's similar to the last century where we had the mob, right? And we figured out ways to organize crime. It took decades to weed them out, and it took a lot of creativity in some cases and different kinds of laws, and I think it's similar here.
Thank you. I think that's a great point, and I'm going to turn this next question. You said organized crime, and this is effectively what it is. It's not just in our public schools, in our universities, in every aspect of society, in our local government, even in, up all the way. They are all the way. They are spreading out, and they use whatever tactic is necessary. Sam, what is to prevent? Something, and this is going to go. Y'all, they're in banking. No one's asked this, and we didn't bring it up, but when we talk about like how their networks, and we've heard a lot about Epic, but that is not the only one. Up in Leander, they're trying to buy property, I know. They're all across our state. They set up their own banking institutions. The mosque owns the land. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then I also want you to talk about, and y'all can jump in that as well, because we hear about Sharia law and what is this? Like, how are they setting up these communes, encampments, cult systems where you're all locked in under the guise, again, of religion? And how can we identify it, and what can be done to stop their use of, again, banking systems and Sharia law within the mosque we need to make Texas the most inhospitable place ever for Islamist supremacists to be. How do we do this?
Well, the effort to set up Epic City modeled itself on two examples. One was an effort by a group called Jamaat al-Fukra, a Pakistani Islamist movement, to set up communes in the US in the 2000s. You might remember one got a lot of news in New York State called Islamburg in upstate New York. And it was an effort by Pakistani Islamists to convert and radicalize black American Muslims, many who were coming out of the Nation of Islam, and invite them to live in these communes. And they set up these communes around the country, including one in Texas, about 100 miles west of Houston. Those largely failed, but then what succeeded overseas was in places like France, where Muslim Brotherhood Islamists set up large mosques, started purchasing the land around, building housing, building healthcare centers, building schools. And this is what I referred earlier to as micro-societies, and this was very much the intention. So groups like EPIC have looked at these two, the East Plano Islamic Center have looked at these two systems and formed something somewhat in the middle. A separate commune like Jamaat al-Fukra, but modeled institution-wise after the French example. And they are particularly dangerous. And as you mentioned, they do include efforts like Sharia banking and Sharia insurance as well. If you take the East Plano Islamic Center, in fact, the Salafi Mosque up in near Dallas, its grounds include a branch of the local Sharia tribunal, the Sharia court up there, as well as a branch of I think an Illinois-based Sharia financial institution. So yeah, absolutely, finance is key to these communes, these communities' success. Sharia finance is an enormous industry, and when I track these 8,000 groups I mentioned, these are the non-profits. Sharia finance is in the for-profits. They're much harder to track because despite the reporting requirements for financial institutions in this country, it's still less than non-profits have to report. So we cannot track their finances or their persons as easily or as well. But it is this is billions of dollars we're talking about. And these financial institutions, these Sharia, halal financial institutions are set up in cahoots with the federal government, with the support of foreign governments, especially Turkey, the UAE and Malaysia. And they are very much controlled by extant Islamist networks. I'll just give one final example because I know I'm going on a bit too long. But there is a very important Muslim Brotherhood network in Virginia called the Safa Network. And it was key in the 90s to funding Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. The federal government decided to stop prosecuting them in the mid-2000s because of that Obama administration policy I mentioned. But they have been key in the establishment of these Sharia financial institutions. And they're doing this in close coordination with the Malaysian government, whose prime minister, by the way, is an American Islamist, or at least an American-trained Islamist. And these financial institutions are now working their way down here to Texas. They've set up shops in Houston, Austin, and Dallas. There's a huge amount we can be doing to stop this. It just requires a bit of wherewithal and grit from the federal government, and then I think perhaps new legislation and political focus here in Texas as well.
Great. I'm going to take the last question, even though they're telling me we don't have time, but it's really, really important. And then Sam, before we wrap up, I want you to just list off the other entities that the state of Texas must designate as terrorist organizations. So the last question on this is, it's about school choice and the education freedom accounts, which launched about 10 weeks ago, hugely successful. 274,000 Texans have said, I want education freedom. I want to get my kids into a value-aligned school. I am tired of the Red-Green Alliance, the Marxist Islamists that have taken over the public schools and we've talked about. So the question was, do Muslim schools get to participate in the ESA program? If you are not an Islamist, supremacist, terrorist-aligned entity, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, you have freedom of religion. If you have a connection, we will find you, we will root you out. Not only will you not participate in the program, you will have your business license pulled. I can tell you there was an article put out recently. The comptroller is on this, the governor, the lieutenant governor, our leaders on this stage. We are not going to give an opening to weaponize our Constitution under the guise of religion. They are on it. So I will say confidently, if you have ties to a terrorist organization, the two that have been designated, and hopefully the ones that Sam is going to rattle off here, that I think these great leaders will help ensure are resonated, absolutely not. We are not going to continue to cede not only our tax dollars, but our freedoms or the weaponization of our Constitution and our freedom that guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of religion so that Islamists, supremacists can subvert our Constitution, our way of life, and overthrow our government. So there you go. Sam, who must be designated foreign terrorist organizations in the great state of Texas?
I mentioned 7 networks. The Brotherhood has already been designated, but the Brotherhood is more than a single nebulous movement. It is specific movements and organizations based per country. So let us designate separately the Egyptian Brotherhood, the Yemeni Brotherhood, the Libyan Brotherhood, the Iraqi Brotherhood. Let us designate Brotherhood offshoots like the Malaysian Muslim Youth Movement. Let us designate Hamas as well, even if it's designated at the federal level, because as I mentioned, the federal government is not using that designation to pursue any kind of action. Moving to Jamaat-e-Islami, the South Asian cousin of the Brotherhood, designate Jamaat-e-Islami Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islami Bangladesh. Both operate proxies and official representatives here in Texas. Both are tied to terror finance and violence in South Asia. Designate offshoots like Hizbul Mujahideen of Jamaat-e-Islami and the Al-Khidmat Foundation, which is based in Pakistan. Designate among the Salafis, I mentioned that Texas is now the base for modernist Salafism around the world. Designate its chief institution, a group called the Al-Maghrib Institute. I call this network of modernist Salafis around the world the Al-Maghrib Network. Designate them. They are tied to dozens of radicalization cases. Of the Deobandis, designate its missionary movement, Tablighi Jamaat. Of the Barelwis, designates a group called Dawat-e-Islami, which I mentioned earlier, but also Tehrik al-Labayek, another important Barelwi movement responsible for acts of violence in Europe, and again, with people here in Texas. Designate Katme Nubuwat, a group whose only purpose is to kill another Muslim sect called the Ahmadiyya. They are here in Texas, Katme Nubuwat. Of the Khomeinis, designate the Houthi network, designate the IRGC separately to the federal designation, designate Lebanese Hezbollah as well. Again, all of these groups are operating here. There are a dozen smaller subsects and sub-movements, like I mentioned as well. Tanzim-e-Islami should be gone. Al-Hadith, another very important group tied to the Mumbai attacks in 2008. They have supporters here in Texas. I'm going to forget a few, and my colleagues are going to notice and point them out.
We have the whole list published, y'all. We have them published.
But of the Islamist networks operating in Texas, these are the most important. They should have been designated decades ago. The federal government is refusing to act. Let the state of Texas do their job.
Wonderful. Okay, so there are, I'll just say, y'all have done an amazing job. There are very important leaders in this state that are watching this panel right now, and I got a text message that said, I'm not going to ask the question, I'm just going to say it, Senator Hagenbu, you have been challenged to make sure that the state government can provide oversight of the financial transactions within our universities. So we're going to have to get on that piece of legislation. We're going to make that happen. No more money from hostile foreign nation, terrorist funding groups, any of that. So there's going to be a lot of activity coming up in the 90th legislative session. Do you want to say anything else before we close out?
Real quickly, I think that this has our attention. I think the governor's highly attentive to it. I think the AG's on it. The legislature, we did SB 2411 last session. We're going to do things we talked about this time. Lieutenant Governor has made his first interim charge looking at Sharia law. So I think it has our attention. I don't think we entirely know how to handle it, but I think there's a lot of energy around it. It's critical that we do these things legislatively. But I just want to say that it's not just that. We can do a lot with our laws, our legislation, things that the governor can do, but this is cultural. And I think that there's that proverb that says that without a vision, the people go astray. We've been not strong enough in teaching our kids our values, the Constitution, the Judeo-Christian family values that our country was built on. And I think that's part of why the MAGA movement happened, I believe. And so we have to, outside of government, in our families, in our school, our churches, teach our kids the culture, then hold out tightly the culture that that made us what we are. You saw that George Washington. You had that video on him, right? He had a quote that I thought was appropriate for this. He said that morals and values are the spring of a popular government. So critical for us to reclaim our culture.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being willing to step into the fight to take on this growing threat that is facing not just Texas, not just America, but all of Western civilization. Please give these men a big round of applause. Offer your support, your prayers, and help us fight back against the Islamist supremacists that seek to subvert our way of life. Thank you.